Falcons Central Radio Show on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, over at FalcFans.com. I'm joined by my good friend Scott Karasik, one of the new. What's your official title, Scott? Are you a managing editor or something like that at Blogging Dirty?
I'm one of the co-editors over at Blogging Dirty. So
Scott will be writing about the Falcons again for all you guys that missed that. So we are back this week. We're going to talk about the Falcons' thrilling win over the New Orleans Saints. We will be talking a little bit about their preview this upcoming week against the hated Carolina Panthers. We will answer your mailbag questions. But as we always start the show off with any sort of roster moves that the Falcons have made over the past week since we last did this show. So we will catch you guys up on that. Nothing major, just a couple of changes to the practice squad. We added Davis Tull, Carter Bykowski, Teron Ward. They replaced Norley Cappy, Devontae Johnson, and Blake Sims. Any of these moves stand out in your eyes, Scott?
I mean, Devontae Johnson kind of sucks. Cappy, I was kind of surprised that Cappy got let go. But then I saw that it was because they brought in Davis Tull, and I like Davis Tull a lot better as both an athlete and a football player. I know you're not a huge Davis Tull fan, but I liked what I saw from him at Chattanooga. I think long term he does have potential to grow into his role as a pass rusher. And if he can play athletically like he did at Chattanooga, it can be a very good addition to this defense. But he's got to actually play and show it. Think like a better version of Troy Bierman that could actually pass rush.
Yeah, I mean, that's the story on Davis Tull. I remember when he came out, it was 2015, and he had a combine, amazing jumps at the combine, out-jumped Vic Beasley at the combine, which people may or may not recall that Vic Beasley, other than Bud Dupree, had these really great jumps. And for any of you that aren't well-versed on that, which if you're watching the show, you probably are, but for a few of you out there, your vertical jumps and your broad jumps are very indicative, particularly with pass rushers with that sort of first step explosion. There's a correlation between those two things. So guys that jump really well typically tend to be explosive first step pass rushers, and Tull had that. But I just remember going back and watching him later on after that and being very underwhelmed with him. I thought he was a pretty underwhelming pass rusher and just didn't have the sort of physicality and length that you really want at that position. Good athlete, didn't really do much in New Orleans, spent his first year injured, and then, didn't do much, and obviously didn't do enough to make their team this year. Everything I read about him from the preseason indicated that he didn't really flash or shine anywhere. So it's a move. I think Cappy really played well, but it is what it is. We'll see how it goes. But I personally am not going to hold my breath that we're going to see Davis Tull contributing to this roster anytime in the near future. It reminds me of when we signed Chase Thomas a couple of years ago, and I was a big fan of Chase Thomas when he was at Stanford. That amounted to nothing. I think he actually wound up in New Orleans. But we'll see what happens. I think probably the more notable move is the Falcons added Teron Ward back to the practice squad after cutting him last week. The Falcons now basically have only two running backs on their roster with Coleman and Freeman, and you can maybe potentially count DeMarco as a third guy. But if Patrick DeMarco's getting carries, that something horrible has happened. So that to me is a concern. I do feel like the Falcons at some point need to address their running back depth, because I don't know if they can make it through 16 games with two running backs. But we'll see how. Maybe they're waiting on Brandon Wiles or Cyrus Gray to clear further injury settlements or something before adding one of those guys. We'll see.
Which would make sense, except I did see that Brandon Wiles got signed by the Jets to their practice squad.
Okay.
So
that ruined that dream.
Well, it could be that they're going to re-sign Brandon Wiles completely. And then, obviously, I think they cut Phillip Wheeler or someone along those lines. I was shocked they didn't really play Schofield this past game.
Yeah, he got in late in garbage time, him and Leroy Reynolds on that drive where they had the screen pass to Ingram, and Reynolds was late to that play. Schofield was in on those last couple of plays. But I think with Schofield, a lot of it is they have to get – he didn't go to the preseason, so it's going to take him a couple of weeks of getting some special teams reps and getting the defensive rep here and there to get into playing shape, because you're just not going to come off the street from basically not doing any football-related stuff all offseason and then be ready to go and play 50 snaps a game. So I think it's going to be a couple of weeks where they have to work him into the lineup before we can see Schofield get significant reps.
Which is fun. It's nice to see that basically after this Panthers game, though, the Falcons are going to have Schofield back, Collins back, probably Campbell back. Might even have Campbell back this week, but just having all these guys back is going to be huge. And it's going to help the defense.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to the thing that you guys all want to hear from us. Which is our recapping of the Falcons Monday night win over the Saints. Falcons won the game 45-32. Really dominated the game on the ground. 217 rushing yards, which I think is the most the Falcons have had in 67 games, going back to the season finale against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the end of the 2011 season, which was essentially the last time the Falcons had a legitimate NFL running game, the 2011 season. So it makes sense that it's been basically 4 full seasons since the Falcons have put up 200-plus rushing yards as a team. Big performance for the Falcons. Another road win for the Falcons. They're now 2-0 on the road, beat a division rival. Only Dan Quinn's second NFC South win, but coming against the Saints, it's certainly a little bit more satisfying than it could be against other opponents. And Scott, I'll concede the floor to you. Where do you want to start when you talk about this game?
I mean, I love seeing Devontae Freeman run all over him. I love seeing Tevin Coleman run all over him. And I'm using their touches that were considered catches, even though they were all basically screen passes. I don't think there was a single pass to Freeman or Coleman this past week that was anything but like a screen or a swing pass, them just being out in the flat with wide open space to run. So I do like the idea that, hey, get them out in space, let them do their thing. But the running backs, it all starts with those two guys. They're the reason why this offense is what it is this year. And I think even with Julio Jones basically as a decoy all day, they were taking advantage of every single hole they could have.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about this Monday morning in my takeaways column where I talked basically about the injury to Julio Jones and how sort of that affected the team last season in 2 notable games where Julio, despite the fact that the Falcons were facing a really weakened secondary like they were facing against the Saints, that Julio really didn't have a big game in those 2 games. That was the Washington game, which was an overtime win, and the 49er game, which was resulted in a loss for the Falcons. And the thing I noted in that column was that in the Washington game, I think one of the reasons why the Falcons were able to win that game was because you had really big performances from Freeman. He had his career high, which was 153 rushing yards. He had like 197 total yards or something like that. And you also had Jacob Tamme have one of the best games of his career, which I think he had like 91 yards or something like that, which is like the second or third highest yardage total he had of his career. And so basically 2 other players really stepped up without Julio being a huge part of the game plan that week and sort of helped the Falcons win that game. And against the 49ers, Devontae Freeman had the worst game of last season with only 12 yards rushing on 12 carries. Tamme had, I think, 61 yards or something. He had an okay game, but it certainly was by no means world-shattering. And I think that was a contributing factor to why the Falcons offense really struggled to be successful in that 49ers game and led to the loss. And so I think the connection here is obviously Devontae Freeman had an amazing performance. Tevin Coleman had hit the best performance of his career this week. And so you got 2 guys like in that Redskins game that really stepped up in the absence of Julio, who only had 1 pass, 1 catch, on 4 or 5 targets or something like that. You also
Yeah.
didn't get a huge contribution from Mohamed Sanu because he got hurt midway through the game. He had 3 catches for maybe 30-something yards. One of those was probably – 1 or 2 of those were pretty big catches. But basically the Falcons really didn't have much to go on with their wide receiver core. A couple of catches from Gabriel and Hardy, and certainly guys did step up to sort of fill the role. But really their offense was dominated by the running backs, with Freeman and Coleman basically representing 60% of their offense in total yards. So, I think that was critical for this team to sort of overcome the absence of Julio Jones, getting guys like Freeman and Coleman to do what they did.
I'll agree. I mean, that was absolutely huge. Just to have – I mean, they were the reason why the team won yesterday. And I think that's really a safe thing to say. But they were the reason why Atlanta scored 45 points. I mean, outside of that Deion Jones interception, every touchdown was either set up or there was a big play on that drive by either Freeman or Coleman to help move the ball along.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think the 14 points the Falcons got off of turnovers were big. I mean, if you remove that from the scoreboard, then it's obviously the outcome could be potentially a lot different because the Falcons won by 13 points. But that pick six by Deion Jones really sort of sealed the win for the Falcons because the Saints were in scoring position. They were driving down the field, were about to cut the lead to what was it, 6 points or something like that at that point with I think 8 or 9 minutes left in the fourth quarter. So, that play was probably the critical play of the defense. Obviously, they had the muff punt early in the game, which got the ball rolling for their offense, giving them really good field position. Obviously, the big thing that we've been talking about for quite some time on this show is the red zone efficiency. They were 5 for 7. So a lot of these things, and, not to be overlooked, the Falcons got 2 sacks, which, based off of how they've played this season and last season, 2 sacks is an amazing accomplishment for this defense.
And let's be fair about the red zone, too. They might have been 5 for 7, but they were only 5 for 7 because one of those drives was at the end of the game, and they had to down the ball and be
That's true.
Be like,
right.
Hey, guys, we win. Sorry. Instead of just jamming it down their throat and teabagging them the way that I wanted them to.
Yeah, you're right. I forgot about that. So it's really 5 for 6.
It's really 5 for 6 when it could have – because, I guarantee you had they just run it with Devontae one more time, they probably would have scored a touchdown.
Yeah, they definitely could have scored if they wanted to.
Yeah, that's how bad the defense for the Saints was yesterday and how good the offense was humming. And I realized that Matt Ryan – I'm actually with Aaron on this. I don't think Matt Ryan played a perfect game. I thought he had 6 or 7 throws that were just like, damn, dude, what are you doing? But at the same time, he's not going to be perfect every week either. So he did his job. He did what he was supposed to do yesterday. They scored 2 touchdowns through the air. They scored 3 on the ground. You can't really get mad at this offense and how it worked yesterday. If it worked like it did yesterday all the time, that'd be amazing. But yeah.
Yeah, my criticism of Matt Ryan is a nitpick. I'm well aware it's a nitpick. I think he missed on a couple of throws. I think it wasn't his perfect. I think really sort of the story of Matt Ryan's season is he has been off a little bit in terms of accuracy this entire year. I think yesterday probably was the worst game, if you want to term it that way, in terms of his inaccuracy. The throws that really sort of concerned me weren't necessarily the times where he was rolling to his left and he threw a little high. That just happens. So, that's understandable. It's certainly forgivable. It was some of those times in the red zone where he was throwing fades to Julio or to Tammy, and he was just throwing it 6 feet over their heads. And those were some of the throws that I tend to be a little bit more questionable. Obviously, it didn't affect the Falcons in the red zone because they were able to punch it in with their running game. But it is a little bit of a concern where, when Matt Ryan's dropping back to throw with relatively clean pockets, he's just missing wide receivers by wide margins. Now, obviously, it's not a huge deal. It's a nitpick. I understand that, but I do think it's something worth pointing out. I know we're going to have a mailbag question when we're talking a little bit later about Matt Ryan, sort of the MVP race. So I guess I'll save the rest of that for that question later on. But it wasn't his best performance. I think overall it's probably a B or B minus, depending on how harsh you want to grade. Overall, solid performance. His ability to sort of pick up yards with his legs. He made a couple of nice throws with pressure in his face. So, overall, I think he did a pretty solid job. But, a couple of those throws, you're just like, where were you throwing that one? And I think a couple of throws he got bailed out by really nice catches from his receivers as well. So credit to the receivers for really stepping up their game and helping Matt Ryan out on a couple of those throws.
Especially Hardy and Gabriel. I thought they played a really good game once the new went down and they had to step up. I thought they did a good job just
I agree.
Going up there, getting those hard catches.
Yeah, so I think that brings an interesting point to the conversation where we last couple of weeks we've been talking a little bit about some of these matchups that we discussed when we preview the game and sort of what the aftermath is. I think if we're being honest, overall, if we're looking at the Falcons wide receivers against the Saints cornerbacks, I think if you're a Saints fan, you sort of feel good about the play of Ken Crawley and Sterling Moore, because I think they did obviously, because as we mentioned before, the Falcons receiver core wasn't a huge part of the game. So with Julio being hurt, with Sanu being hurt, and Hardy and Gabriel having a couple of catches, you probably feel a little bit better about your cornerback core. So if, obviously they didn't win the game, but I think if you're a Saints fan, you can feel like, okay, we probably won that matchup. We were able to sort of survive 1 week with our cornerbacks. But I think when you flip it on the other side with the Falcons cornerbacks,
I think if you see that Sanu and Julio were both basically hurt the whole game, you kind of flip that back and you're like, well, the only reason why we looked good was because they were hurt too.
Yeah, no, I think that goes into the equation. But I do feel like Sterling Moore and King Crawley, like King Crawley was, again, I know people are going to be mad at me for saying this, but like, I know Julio was hurt, but King Crawley was draped all over Julio the whole game. And, even
because Julio was hurt, he was running press and he had deep coverage, safety coverage all the time.
I get that, Scott. Like, I'm not trying to sit here and bash Julio. I understand that. But I'm saying, like, when you take your Falcons lenses off of it, you have to give King Crawley some credit for being able to go toe-to-toe with Julio Jones, even an injured Julio Jones, and doing a pretty good job. That's all I'm saying.
That's fair.
Now, I think on the other side of the coin, I think the Saints wide receivers, that was somewhat of a concern going into last week. I think the Falcons got a bit of a break with Willie Snead being out of the game. So that sort of took a little less pressure off of Brian Poole to have to step up and be a difference maker. But I think the Falcons cornerbacks definitely got the better. I think Desmond Trufant really shut down Brandon Cooks. I know Michael Thomas and Brandon Coleman, each had like 7 catches for like 70-something yards. And so I know on paper they look pretty good. But, when your quarterback is dropping back and throwing the ball 56 times in a game, you're going to give up some yards in the passing game. So I saw somewhere where someone wrote today that they thought Robert Alford struggled, which I don't think is a real fair comparison. He gave up some receptions, but I think that was more towards the end of the game when the Falcons were playing a little bit more softer in terms of their coverage to not give up the big play. So, giving up a 9-yard completion here, a 13-yard completion here, a 12-yard completion here, I don't think it's a huge deal. But I know probably on the stat sheets, Alford probably gave up a bunch of yards. But did you have any thoughts on that, Scott?
I mean, they did allow some big completions like Brandon Coleman, Michael Thomas, Tommy Lee Lewis. All those guys had some pretty deep catches, but it felt like they were all against either Brian Poole or They were like the flea flicker where Brandon Coleman ran halfway across the field and beat Alford, but he had like 8 seconds to do it.
Yeah.
So it was more, if there's a pass rush, the corner's going to look a lot better. Though, to be fair, Drew Brees threw 54 passes yesterday. So it's tough to go out there every single play and deliver every single solitary play on 54 passes against one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the league.
Yeah, I mean, he completed 36 passes, so you're going to give up some catches and some yards.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess to me, like, yeah, you're right. I think Poole had some struggles. He got beat a couple of times. He made some nice plays. He deserves most of the credit for that Deion Jones pick 6 for jumping that route and reading that perfectly, because that was a play that they beat him on to get that touchdown earlier to Michael Thomas. But, I think if you're pointing fingers at the Falcons secondary, it's probably more at the linebackers and the safeties, just because of how effective Kobe Fleener was over the middle of the field. I know they put C.J. Goodwin on him late in the game because they were playing a lot of dime at the end of the game. And Goodwin was out there on the field, and he got beat a couple of times. Deion Jones got beat on that one play, which I think they pulled him out after the game right after that, late in the fourth quarter. I know Neal let him sneak behind him for another big play. So Fleener had a big game. And so, the concern is, until Devondre Campbell comes back, our tight end is going to be a problem for the Falcons. If we're judging by these last 2 weeks, the answer seems to be yes.
Yeah, I mean, that was the whole point of drafting Devondre Campbell. That was what his strength was going to be. And then the minute he's gone, tight ends start destroying them. I mean, there's only so much you can do. I mean, and Campbell wasn't horrible in the first game either. Like, I want to say anytime a tight end had a big play, it was because it was on Sean Weatherspoon, or because they were going against. I mean, there was that one play that Safarian Jenkins had.
Yeah.
And then, like, Brate had a couple of 10-yard catches, which, I mean, that's going to happen. And then that Brandon Myers 4-yard touchdown. So combined, they had those 5 catches from the five catches from the tight ends for 64 yards and 2 touchdowns. But 2 of them were against Weatherspoon.
Yeah.
So I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I don't think Campbell's coverage ability was a problem in week 1, other than that one pass interference, which, it happens.
Yeah.
So that is a concern. Kobe Fleener struggled the first 2 games of the year, but seemed to come alive against the Falcons, which is kind of the Falcons' MO. When, you're a tight end and you're in a slump, just play the Falcons and you'll break out of that slump. So that is a concern, and I think getting Campbell back will certainly help. Weatherspoon did seem to struggle quite a bit against the Saints covering running backs. Cadet really gave him some fits among other players. And so that is a concern that, Weatherspoon's not a spring chicken anymore, as they say. And anytime he faces a fast running back, we're going to see similar situations as we saw last year with Warlow and Justin Durant, where those guys are going to be able to sort of win those matchups. The good thing you can say about Weatherspoon is, at least in run support, I wouldn't say necessarily balancing the scales, but he's doing something to balance the scales. He's good in the run, bad in coverage. It makes it that maybe, if you're being optimistic, you can say it's an average performance overall. And hopefully we won't have to endure it for that much longer if Campbell is able to come back this week or next week. So we'll see what happens.
I guess for me, the problem is that it's cool that Weatherspoon can stop the run for those 23, 24 attempts that other teams have. But when they're passing it 50 times, it doesn't help. His coverage is just absolutely atrocious. And having him out there is a liability. And I never thought I'd be saying that about Sean Weatherspoon in 2016, back when the Falcons drafted him. I thought by now he'd be in his prime. It'd be great. He'd be looking amazing still. But he's a pure liability in coverage. He's solid against the run. honestly, I wouldn't mind seeing him move over to strong side linebacker in the base and seeing him as more of a run stuffing, pass rushing kind of guy. And then if he's on the field in the nickel, it's in like a 3-3-5 and he's blitzing. But at this point, he's useless in coverage.
Fair enough. I was trying to paint a rosy picture for Sean Weatherspoon because he's still my guy, but I can't disagree with anything you said.
Yeah, love him, but wish he would have been so much better.
On the opposite end of the spectrum, we talked a little about Freeman and Coleman. Who were some of the other guys that you thought stood out on Monday night in terms of deserving of game balls?
Oh, Dion. He was everywhere. He was knocking balls away. He was he was hitting guys as they were catching it to knock the ball out. And I realized he didn't have anything that was a crazy hit like what Keanu Neal had on that one play. But there were times when he would just tackle a guy from behind right as he was catching it, and boom, the ball would pop out. I think I saw 2 or 3 plays over the middle exactly like that. And it was nice to see. And I want to see more of that from pretty much everybody, which is a standard form tackle that wraps the arms as the guy's trying to catch the ball and bring it in. It makes it really tough to catch because they get the alligator hands. So, yeah, let me see more actual tackling right as guys are catching the ball, and coverage will look better. And then, that pick six you can't ever get mad at. He had, I think, 8 or 9 tackles. He looked good. I really liked what he did. I thought Deion Jones is showing why he got drafted in the second round through 3 games. He's fast. He can cover. He's solid enough in the run game to start right now. And as he gets bigger, he'll have more strength and power in the run game. And he'll play a little bit better to make guys like you happy, Aaron. But if teams are passing 55 times a game against the Falcons, and of their 25 runs, 8 of them are draws, you might as well take a shot. You might as well have him out there doing everything you can, because I think he's got that potential to be that next Bobby Wagner type guy in that middle of the defense.
Okay. I agree with you. I think this was definitely Deion Jones' best performance. It may sound a little nitpicky. I don't think he was an amazing performance. The fact that every draw play the Saints called went for 10 or 15 yards still is an issue for me. I think I need to see a little bit more improvement with his ability to take on blocks in those situations and sort of jack up an offensive lineman. Those couple of times he got beat in coverage. But again, I'm nitpicking. A really solid performance for Deion Jones. He's definitely on his way, and I'm very curious to see what improvements he'll make as the rest of the season goes on. But this was definitely a big game for him, particularly a homecoming, playing in front of his home crowd, in front of family and friends, and really having the big play that sort of sealed the Falcons' win. You can't take anything away from that with the pick six. So definitely a big step in the right direction. I'm a little harder on Deion Jones probably than most people are. I wouldn't say it's a fair sort of harshness, but
it's not. It's because you don't take into account that he's a rookie.
Yeah, I don't grade rookies on curves. So if you're doing your job, you're doing your job, regardless of whether you're a 10-year veteran or a rookie, in my opinion. But for a rookie, he's been great. He's been great for a rookie. As far as him being on Bobby Wagner's level, I think we're probably 2 or 3 years away from that. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, but he can at least be NFL average or above average on the way to it, which I'm okay with that.
Oh, I'm very confident that he's going to be above average. To me, the question, I think if we're putting him on a 10-point scale, I think he'll probably be a 6 at some point in time. I don't think he's there quite yet, but certainly a 6 at some point in time. To me, the big question is, can he be a 7 or an 8 on that 10-point scale? And only time is going to be able to tell as far as that goes.
I think that if you go with a 10-point scale, let's say right now he's probably a 5. He's probably right at that league average.
After last night's game, I'd be willing more. Probably over the first 2 weeks, I probably would say he's probably a 4.5 or a 4. But after last night's game, I'm willing to bump it up to a 5. So I agree with you on that.
But I think if he continues on this track that he's on, he could progress to being that 6 by the end of the year.
That's a fair step, and I agree with that too.
And if he's a 6 his entire career with potential for big plays like that, that's still more than what Warlow was, which was like a 2.
Yeah, that's true as well.
So you're massively upgrading the guy in the middle who's calling all the plays with a guy who's going to give you solid play all around and a big play here and there, which I'm okay with. That's what you want.
It's fine. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think a lot of these things are upgrades. To me, the big question for the Falcons in terms of, if we're talking big picture and in terms of them going from a team that can compete for a wild card to a team that's a wild card lock, is they just need more guys that are definite playmakers, that are definite difference makers, that other teams are looking at and saying, I'm scared about that guy. And I think outside of Trufant, outside of Julio, and outside of Devontae, I don't know if there's enough guys right now on this team that are like that. So I do feel like that's going to take a little bit more time than, the next 13 games. But certainly if we can get some above average players in the meantime that can sort of be good but not like, oh no, we're scared of Deion Jones or we're scared of Jacob Tamme type of players, but are solid in their roles, I think that's fine. There's no complaining about that. That's definite progress. And then, getting those dominant difference makers, the Fletcher Coxes of the world, the Levante Davids of the world is, something that we can focus on in the future. And if that's, that's not an easy thing to do to get those types of players because they don't grow on trees. But if that's all you got to do to make that next step, then that's being in a better place than saying, we just have a bunch of below average players like we were saying, 2 years ago on defense.
Yeah, now I feel like at least at 2 levels of the defense, they've got guys with that I feel like at the end of the year are going to be above average. I think you're looking at all the guys in the secondary. Like Ricardo Allen might be the one weak spot. I think he's going to be a solid 5 his entire career. But Keanu Neal has the potential to be that. Like, I thought he looked solid last night, but I think he's got that potential to be that 6 by the end of the year. I think Deion Jones, Devondre Campbell have that potential to be those 6s by the end of the year. Alford and Trufant are already in that 7-8 range no matter what. Trufant's probably in that 10 range, if we're being honest here. So when you look at those back 2 levels of the defense, you are looking at a lot better play. And hopefully something just turns on for Vic. Hopefully a switch just gets flipped in the next couple of weeks and he just starts sacking everybody. And he gets, a sack a week the rest of the season. That'd be amazing. I hope. Not expecting it, but I hope it happens.
Hopefully. We'll see what happens. I don't put a whole lot of stock in terms of stats from the first 3 games of the season because I think it's hard to sort of parse out who's good and who's not off of a 3-game sample. But it is a little bit of a concern to me how bad the Falcons' pass defense has been these first 3 weeks, at least statistically. And I do wonder a little bit if maybe we're sort of taking how good our secondary and how good our back 7 is for granted. Like, I don't feel like they're a liability by any means, but I do wonder if because we're so upset with the pass rush, we're sort of overlooking that our secondary and our pass defense overall has not been very good this year. So that is something to keep an eye on in the future. I don't lose any – like, I look at our back 7, I'm like, I'm fine with that. I'm not losing any sleep over those guys. Like, I feel pretty confident about what they're going to do on a week-to-week basis. But I do wonder, as we get later on in the season, if some of these sort of chunk yardage plays that we seem to be giving up by a lot this year as compared to last year where we were one of the better teams in the league at avoiding the big play, I wonder if that's going to be a concern moving forward. So, part of that against the Saints was because they were playing from behind and they were taking shots downfield. So I can't be too mad about it. But, if that continues to be a problem these next couple of games, that is going to be something to keep an eye on.
Possible. I mean, I think even with Poole and Collins, I think you're looking at some solid football players there.
Yeah, I think that individually I'm fine with our guys. It's just for some reason it's not working from the sum of the parts.
It all comes down to pass rush. I think that's really what it is. And maybe they've got to press a little bit more in order to get the pass rush there. Maybe if they press at the line and they start jamming receivers and they start giving the pass rush that extra half second to start getting off their blocks, maybe that's the difference. Maybe if they would have called a holding call on Vic Beasley yesterday too. I thought he was creating some pressure at times, and every time he got behind the line, it looked like Streif had two hands full of jersey. So
yeah, I mean, it's early in the season, so I don't want to have any bold takeaways. I agree with you. I think the pass rush is an issue. We obviously didn't have a great pass rush last year, and it didn't really affect our secondary's play. I do wonder maybe the reason why we're struggling a little bit more early this year is the quality of quarterbacks that we're facing. Jameis Winston and Drew Brees in particular. Derek Carr is not a bad quarterback, but I don't think he played well in that Raiders game. So I do wonder if as we progress this year and we have we're not going to have very many games against the Brendan Whedons and the Zach Mettenbergers of the world. Maybe unlike last year, without a great pass rush, that didn't matter much because we were playing quarterbacks that were missing throws. And this year we may not have that luxury. So again, it's something worth keeping the eye on. And certainly because we're playing much better quarterbacks this year, our pass rush is probably going to be a lot more important to our success than it was last year. All right, Scott, you got anything else to say about the Saints game before we move on to the Panthers game?
Nothing else other than we dat.
Okay, there you go. We did get did we get a mailbag question? Yeah, we did get one from our good friend Brian from Pro Football Central. He asked, would Scott ever hold hands with a Saints fan?
If she looked like Scarlett Johansson.
Oh, there you go. There's your answer, folks. All right, let's talk about the upcoming game against the Panthers. The Panthers are 1-2, having a little bit of that Super Bowl hangover. To be fair to them, they did play two of the top defenses in the NFL in these first 3 weeks with the Broncos and the Vikings, who you can make an argument are the two best defenses in the NFL so far this year. So, I don't know if they'll come into that buzzsaw against the Falcons, but, that's going to be one of the tests. We'll see how much of the Panthers are down this year because they quality of competition, or are they just generally down overall? Obviously we talk about the injuries going into this week. It's early in the week, so we don't really have a whole lot of information to glean from this. Mohamed Sanu, we mentioned earlier, left the game with a shoulder injury, but he's expected to play. Same thing with Matt Ryan, who got a thumb injury to his non-throwing hand late in the game. Shouldn't be an issue for him moving forward. The two players where the injuries are a little bit more of a question mark is Devontae Campbell coming back from his ankle injury this week, and how much is Julio Jones's calf injury going to affect him this week? We obviously saw it did affect him quite a bit this past week against the Saints. So, going up against the Panthers defense, which should be a significant improvement over the Saints, I do think we're going to need Julio Jones to pull a little bit more weight than one reception for 16 yards. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on. On the opposite side, for the Panthers, their injuries, Cam Newton tweaked his ankle, but he's expected to play. They got a couple of guys out. I think Jonathan Stewart is still out with a hamstring injury, so Cameron Artis-Payne and Fozzie Whitaker are expected to play this week. Vernon Butler is out with an ankle injury, so I guess
they re-signed Kevin Love to play some snaps. They also brought in Michael Griffin for some depth.
Yeah, so they worked out Michael Griffin. Did they actually make that move official?
They made that move official about 45 minutes ago.
Okay, there you go. It's live news, breaking news, guys. So obviously the Stewart injury is a significant one. Butler has been playing well based off of what I've seen from him, but they already have a deep defensive tackle rotation. So when Paul Solia is like your fourth string defensive tackle, you're going to be just fine. The Stewart injury is probably the biggest one, but we've seen Fozzie Whitaker and we've seen Cameron Artis-Payne have success against our defense. So it's not as if like the Panthers, at least if you're a Panther fan, you're sitting here like, oh, we can't run the ball against the Falcons with those two guys. So that would be something to see whether the Falcons can sort of take advantage of that and put the clamps on those two guys who have had a little bit too much success these last couple of years running the ball on the Falcons. We know both teams want to run the football. In terms of key matchups this week to look for, both teams are run-first offenses that they're going to want to establish the run. It probably will be able to figure out who won this game by who runs the ball better than the other team. So that's going to be a big test for both the Falcons offense and the Panthers offense. Our run defense has been solid to underwhelming at times, so it's a little bit more of a question mark where we kind of know with the Panthers, their run defense, I don't think has been as great as it has been in previous years, but certainly with their front seven, we can expect a reasonably high level of execution. So this will be a big test for this running game to see whether or not the success of the last 2 weeks has been because we've been feasting on weaker defenses or are we legitimately one of the better running teams in the league now. And being able to run the ball against the Panthers will tell us quite a bit about that. Scott, what do you feel about that particular matchup or any other matchups that you're looking forward to seeing this week?
I mean, I'd love to see the Falcons' offensive line look good this week. I'd like to see them look a lot like they looked last night, but I don't think that's realistic. It wouldn't be crazy to see the Falcons go for over 120 yards on the ground and really commit to the running game, especially with how they were blocking. They blocked the Raiders really well. They blocked the Bucks pretty well, but they didn't really commit to the running game, so they couldn't really get anything going against the Buccaneers because they never committed. As long as they can commit to the running game, I think that the run game will be fine and it'll gain some yards. Also, the Bucs pretty much sold out against the running game and said, hey, Ryan has to beat us with his arm. Which I can understand why they did that.
Yeah. Yeah. Just some stats to throw at you guys, just to put this thing into context. Last year, in the 2 games we played the Panthers, we combined for 131 rushing yards. In the 2 games they played against us, we gave up 297 rushing yards. So that needs to be a little bit more even, a little bit more balanced this year. We can't be as ineffective running the ball against them, and they can't be as effective running the ball against us. So, that to me is going to be an interesting matchup to see which team can win the ground game. I know the Panthers have sort of prided themselves on being the more physical team these last couple of years. I think the Falcons are 2-4 against the Panthers these last 3 seasons. And it's largely been because they've been able to own the line of scrimmage. And I would love to see that flip and change. I'm not super, super optimistic that that's going to happen, but at least, at the very least, I can be a little bit somewhat optimistic that we can sort of break even on that. And then, other factors like maybe a healthy Julio Jones will come into play and sort of be the deciding factor in the outcome of the game in the Falcons' favor. On that same note of winning in the line of scrimmage, I would also like to see this be the week where the Falcons' pass rush really steps up. We saw progress against the Saints, but 2 sacks on 56 dropbacks is still a little underwhelming. The
They did
Panthers
get a
gave up.
little bit of solid pressure throughout the day.
They did, but you want to see a little bit more than that. I think with the Panthers, they're coming off a game where they gave up 7 sacks to the Vikings. I don't think anybody's can confuse the talent the Falcons have up front with the Vikings talent up front. But Mike Rimmers and Michael Oher seem to have come back down to earth a little bit since last season, and those seem to be the 2 guys that we could really attack this week with Freeney and Beasley. So I'm hoping to see those guys sort of build off of what we saw was their best game to date against the Saints and do a little bit more damage and really get after Cam Newton, because we know Cam Newton has been a problem for the Falcon defense over the years. So you feel like this is a week where the Falcons pass rush can make us proud, Scott?
I think so. I think Remmers really struggles with speed. And as long as Vic Beasley can get it into his head to stick with the speed rush pretty much every play and just tire Remmers out and then go into his counter moves, I think that'll help out a lot. I think he gets a little too cute with his spin moves sometimes, tries to break it out and then go back inside, and it's just too telegraphed. It's not tight. It doesn't work. Spinning to the left doesn't work for him. He'd probably be better off if he tried to cut inside and then spun outside and used the speed to his advantage. You saw it against Streif when he was just going with his speed move the entire time, bending the edge the entire time. He was owning Streif. And I think he could do the same kind of thing. It actually got to the point where they were putting extra running backs in there to help combat against Freeney and Beasley to make sure that Breeze did have enough time to throw the ball, because they saw that their tackles were struggling, and their tackles were struggling last night to hold up against Beasley and Freeney.
Mm-hmm.
So the talent's there. The Falcons have the ability to get after Cam Newton. I do think that they need to do the standard base defense, at least the formation, a lot of the time, because running in the nickel doesn't work against these guys. They're going to run the ball if they see you in nickel. They rarely run 3 receivers out there, 3 wide receivers out there. They're almost always out there with Tolbert, almost always out there with 2 running backs. It doesn't make sense to go out of anything but the base for most of the game. And I think that's what they did last year in the second game. They kind of saw their issues from the first game. But I think if they can really get things going, really get some pass rush on Cam Newton, the game will be a lot closer to the second game last year than the first game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. Do you think we'll see Desmond Trufant shadow Kelvin Benjamin this weekend? And do you feel like if Devondre Campbell misses another game, can the Falcons handle Greg Olsen?
So I love the idea of Trufant shadowing Benjamin, but I don't really think it's needed unless he's in the slot. Like if Benjamin is there if Benjamin's there on the other side, I think Alford can handle him. I think Alford does better with slower guys. But I think if he's there on the right, like obviously if he's there on the right side, Trufant can handle him. But if he's in the slot, I don't know if Poole can really handle him. I think you're going to have to throw some combination of maybe Ricardo Allen, maybe Poole, maybe, slide Trufant over, maybe slide Alford over, depending on which side he's on, and just flip those guys. And whichever side he's on, have either Alford or Trufant handle him. Obviously, you're not going to prevent Benjamin from catching the ball all day, but if you can limit him to 5 catches, 60 yards, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
And then if Campbell's out covering Olsen, I mean, unless they're really willing to put someone on him one-on-one, that's really where the Akeem King making the roster made sense. Unless they feel like CJ Goodwin can be that guy, or that Keanu Neal is that guy that can just be on him one-on-one, I don't understand the point of just running zones all day. Olsen's a guy who's going to destroy zones all day. He's too smart. He's got good route running. He's going to find the hole. He's going to attack it. He's going to destroy it. I think if you put a guy on him one-on-one, like a Keanu Neal, or you do a split bracket where it's a matchup zone, where you do have like Schofield in the short area and then Neal in the farther back area, in the hook zones and the deeper zones, you'll be a lot better off.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. So what do you think are some of the keys to the game for the Falcons to win this one?
Got to run the ball. If you can't run the ball, then you can't control it. You can't force the play action. You can't get those big, deep passes to Julio. You can't get those underneath passes to Sanu to work. You can't get those passes to Tammy to work. Got to run the ball because the entire offense is predicated around the run. Gotta knock Cam Newton around like he's a punching bag. Gotta hit him. Gotta hit him 5, 6, 7, 8 times. And I know that's going to be tough, but you got to do it. Like, that's the thing that the Falcons really have to do in order to affect them. Now, whether it's on a run and you're just laying them out, whether it's on a pass and, you get him in the backfield, you just got to hit him. Got to. If he's on a rollout and you clobber him, got to do it. There's just no reason. The only way to make Cam uncomfortable is to not hurt him, but, like, you got to hit him. You got to make him feel pain. You got to have him kind of writhing. That's what happened in the second Falcons game last year for the Panthers. That's what's going to have to happen for the Falcons this year.
Okay. Now, we got a mailbag question from Big Boy Brewski. Basically, he's asking about matchups. I'm just curious, Scott, if there were any other matchups you're looking forward to watching that we didn't get to earlier.
I really want to see how the Falcons utilize this Coleman and Freeman tandem this week, because this was the game that I've been watching the last 3 weeks going, man, if they can get everything going with those two, this could be the week that Atlanta kind of makes its name for itself and is like, hey, I don't care how many picks you spend on your front seven. I don't care how good you think Thomas Davis and Luke Kuechly and Shaq Thompson are. We're going to get it to our running backs in space, and they're going to beat you with chunk plays all day.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this will be a big test for us because we won't have the benefit of, playing soft defenses. Like, the Raiders' defense is much softer than I think most people expected it to be this year. We know the Saints' defense is soft. Tampa Bay's defense was put up a decent fight against us and probably hasn't played particularly well in recent weeks. But it is one of those things where the Panthers are legitimate. And even though they haven't played to their sort of normal precision, we know that this team knows how to play us, and we know Kuechly's going to be good. Thomas Davis is going to be good. KK Short's going to be good. Other players, Charles Johnson is going to do his job. So it's a certain litmus test and a measuring stick for us to see whether we can assert our will on another team. And as you say, run the football, because you're right. It's really about running the ball, and it's especially if Julio is going to be a little nicked up and thus not going to be able to prey upon the Panthers' corners as much as he did last year in that second game. I don't necessarily feel like Jacob Tammy or Mohamed Sanu are going to go off this week. So it's really going to be a lot on Freeman and Coleman to do what they've done so far this year and really sort of carry the offense if that's the case. Now, obviously, if Julio is ready to go and it's Julio again, then great. That's wonderful. But, there's got to be a little bit of a plan B to try to get other guys involved and keep spreading the ball around and not resort to being that one-man team that sort of got us into trouble in the middle of last season. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on this week.
I do think that the Falcons are better off to handle the stretch runs like they were last year than they were last year. It's just that this stretch run is a lot tougher than last year's was. But maybe it's one of those teams that rises to the occasion.
Yeah. Big Boy Brewski asks another question. He says, do you have any predictions against the Panthers?
I'm not going to make any predictions on the game. I didn't do it last week. It was good. We didn't do it the week before. It was good. I'm tired of this whole predicting because whatever I predict ends up wrong. Whatever Aaron ends up
Yes, I
predicting
know
ends
that
up
feeling.
wrong. And I'm done. I'm done predicting games for the rest of my life. I will never predict another game.
Well, I'll do this. I have expected the Falcons to lose the last 2 weeks. They have won, so I will keep that streak alive and expect them to lose, and hopefully I will end up being wrong again. So, even though I do legitimately think this is a much bigger tough test than the last 2 games, but we'll see what happens.
Hopefully the Falcons win. That's all I'm going to say. I want them to win. I think they can win. They just have to show up and execute, and I think they can do it. But that means they've got to show up and execute and play like the Falcons can play at the top end of their variance, not at the bottom end of their variance.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I've been a little questioning of whether Dan Quinn can get this team ready to play. I thought, these last 2 weeks, he, sort of silenced that sort of question, and I'm hoping that he does it again this week. So that this is no longer a question of, are they, because I think going into these last couple of games, I've sort of seen the Dan Quinn Falcons more as the Jim Moore Falcons, which was a good team when they show up, but you never know which games they're going to show up for. And that was sort of one of the reasons why, particularly in the 05 and 06 seasons, the Falcons were so up and down those years and wound up, basically going 500. And I feel like, say what you want about Mike Smith's team, but they pretty much they showed up every week. Now, that didn't necessarily mean that they were going to win that game, but you never felt like, oh, they're just going to completely shut it down and just completely not show up. And I feel like, we're building towards what type of team Dan Quinn's Falcons are going to be. Are they going to be the low variance Mike Smith sort of team, or are they going to be the high variance sort of Jim Moore sort of team? Both have their strengths and weaknesses, but I would much rather prefer a very more consistent team that we can expect, this level of performance week in and week out. And, so.
Or hopefully the low end is games like versus the Bucks, this first game of the year.
Yeah.
Where the offense still scores some points, the defense might have a bad day. And the high end is obviously the Saints game, where the offense just looks unstoppable. But the defense needs to get their shit together. There's no other way of putting that than they need to get their shit together. They've allowed way too many points.
Yep. All right. Let's get into these mailbag questions. We got plenty. So first one, I think is going to be one that you will enjoy answering, Scott, is from our friend Cookie by Nature. He asked, should Brian Cox be fired?
If the Falcons can't break 30 sacks this year, yes. I know pass rush isn't all about sacks, but if they can't break that magic number of 30 and Hageman still looks like Hageman's been looking and Beasley still looks like Beasley's been looking, it's not like Beasley was bad in college, guys. Beasley was amazing in college. There's a reason why I had Beasley as a top player in the 15 draft. It wasn't because he looked like crap in college. It's because he looked amazing in college. He looked even better at the combine. And I saw a guy who could be a guy who took over games the way he did, like the last Panthers game from last year. But this idea of the defensive line rotation being run the way it's run is just stupid. And I'm starting to wonder if that 2014 stupidity wasn't because of Brian Cox as opposed to it being, Mike Smith and Mike Nolan, of putting these guys in positions that don't make sense. I mean, if you use guys that actually play defensive tackle at defensive tackle in the nickel, maybe you wouldn't have guys gash you up the middle every fucking play.
Yeah, I think criticizing Brian Cox is very legitimate. Um, I tend to steer away from the whole "we should fire this guy" sort of talk. I just sort of feel like it's hard to be able to say whether an assistant coach deserves to be fired because unless you're there at practice every day or in the film room, because assistant coach's job is really about is Monday through Saturday getting a team his position group prepared for a game, and on Sunday it's more about the head coach and the D coordinator and the offensive coordinator. I at least that's my general philosophy. And so if you have an issue with the results on Sunday, then I think you need to blame one of those three people as opposed to a position coach. But
Yeah,
again,
but if you're having issues with the results on Sunday, it's because the position coach didn't prepare them Monday through Saturday.
that is true at points. And sometimes, I think the Falcons' issue is they're not talented enough on the front. I don't think it's not to say that they're devoid of talent on their D line. I think they have NFL caliber players for the most part. I just don't think they have anybody that anybody else is looking at. Oh no, we got to worry about that guy. And I feel like a lot of the Brian Cox backlash has been, I think stems from comments that Stephen White, the former Buccaneers defensive end who does work for SB Nation or Bleacher Report or whoever, basically called out Brian Cox and questioned whether he was a good coach, largely because that Vic Beasley didn't have as good a rookie season as Stephen White thought he did. And, I think that's sort of the onus behind that's been driving this Brian Cox must go. I think that was the thing that basically incepted the Falcon fan base's mind in terms of that. So I feel like, for me, my personal take is I feel like a lot of what it is basically people not wanting, not being willing to face a possible reality where maybe Vic Beasley isn't as good as we thought he was. I was a fan of Vic Beasley. I didn't see him as like the next John Abraham or next Von Miller, but I certainly thought he would be a good NFL player and potentially would develop into a 10-sack guy. Now, that's not me saying, as some people would want to say, that he's a bust or anything, but I just do think maybe his ceiling isn't as high as we once thought he was, and I feel like Brian Cox is taking the brunt of that issue a little bit unfairly. And, personally, I would like to see, Brian Cox work with a few more talented players because I feel like the Falcons sort of put their plan this offseason as far as improving their pass rush was basically improvement by Vic Beasley and Derek Shelby. And I feel like Vic Beasley hasn't really shown a whole lot of improvement so far, and Derek Shelby has been a non-entity. And so, I don't blame Brian Cox for that. Like, I feel like that's a team decision that they decided that they didn't want to invest in their pass rush this offseason, and you're seeing the results of that. So that's my perspective on it. Okay. I'm sure we will get this question many more times this year. So our next question comes from Ryan O'Brien. It's a long one. He says, I know we are not a big press team, but wouldn't it make sense for Alford to come up and get his hands on their receivers? It could have really messed with the timing of the routes. Brees seemed to be playing pitch and catch for a while, just hitting that third step on the drop back and the ball was out. Alford did try to jump one at the end and almost got the pick. Seemed like they were hitting that all night and taking 7 yards at a time.
Yeah, it would make sense. It makes sense for all these guys to come up and press because I think if you press, you give that offense or the defensive line that extra half second to get into their push. If they're in their push, everybody's pressed at the line, as in all the receivers are pressed at the line, then you've got everybody getting jammed. You've got a defense that's saying, hey, come challenge us man-to-man, one-on-one, see if you can get open. And then the defensive line does have a shot to really make that difference.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Alford probably should have pressed a little bit more. I noticed it being more problematic towards the end of the game when the Falcons had a bigger lead. So I do feel like it's a little forgivable because the Falcons were more worried about the big play than the the quick hitters. But I think Alfred is much better pressing, and that's where his strength lies. So you can't disagree with anything you say, Ryan. Next question comes from Ryan. He says, any question, Coleman is the most improved player from last year. Wow, what a difference a year makes. Looks like the Indiana player, again, that I was really excited about drafting, just a bigger version. Really impressive. Freeman and Coleman can make quite the combo.
I have no complaints about Tevin Coleman this year. He's done everything that's been asked of him. I mean, he may not have the perfect vision or the perfect balance to be a starting running back in the league, but you put the ball in his hands, you hope for something big. And I like how they're putting him out in space and passing the ball a lot more, because I think that's where he's really going to shine. Get him into space and then worry about the rest of it from there.
Yeah, look, I think Coleman has played very well. I think certainly it's a toss-up between him and Grady Jarrett, who's the most improved player. Certainly Coleman is hands down on offense, and Grady Jarrett probably would win on defense. I think Coleman still has a ways to go as a running back in terms of his vision, in terms of his lateral agility. I think he's good in spots. I think he's a good change of pace runner. I think he's excellent in the passing game because – he's a really good straight line guy, but anytime he has to make a cut or make a decision that requires him to change direction, I don't think he's particularly good at that. I don't think that's an issue. The only issue I have with that is sort of, we talk about this, and this is probably making a mountain out of a molehill, but I don't feel like this whole conversation of Freeman and Coleman, they're on the same playing field, and that's where I sort of, put my foot down, and sort of that's where I get into the the things that Tevin Coleman doesn't do well. But I feel like he's an excellent role player, excellent change of pace running back. Do I feel like the Falcons offense would be as in good hands if Freeman got hurt and Coleman had to take over? No, but I do feel like Coleman could get the job done to a certain extent, probably not as well as Devontae Freeman has, but he'd be competent at the very least. So I feel like, Coleman has done well. I just don't feel like, I think Devontae Freeman's in a different zip code as far as a player goes. But the question is about Coleman, so I don't want to sound like I'm bashing Coleman just because he's not as good as Devontae Freeman, which is there's a worse life to live than being that. Another one from Ryan O'Brien. He says, is it time to draw up more blitzes to get pressure? That Trufant cornerback blitz was a thing of beauty.
I am not against the idea of blitzing ever. To me, the idea of going in man, pressing, and then blitzing, that's defense. So I'm always down to see a fun, maybe Devondre Campbell, Vic Beasley off the edge, Babineau, Jarrett, and, maybe you throw Hageman in there in like a 3-4 style blitz on a third down, and just have those guys run out of 3-3-5 and have some fun with it. I have no problems with something like that. I think that looks like fun. I think that sounds like fun. I think that's would only be good for the defense. I'm down. Throw more bodies at the pass rush if you need to. You got a pair of corners that could do well in press man. If you don't want to do the pure deep whatever, the pure deep ball all the time, the pure deep zones all the time, you might as well do it. So.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to this question is a little weird because it's like more blitzes, that's a relative term. 6 is more than 5. So, I'd be in favor of more blitzes in that sort of sense. I don't feel like we need to suddenly become a blitz-heavy team. We need to, be borrowing pages from Rob Ryan or anything like that in terms of our, or Rex Ryan in terms of our exotic blitzes and whatnot, or Todd Bowles. Because I'm with you, Scott. I think on the outside, Alfred and Trufant can handle it. But I do wonder about Poole because it does seem like he's much better in zone than staying on an island. Now, I think with if and when Campbell comes back, I think you can be a little bit more willing to dial up those blitzes just because he's by far our best linebacker in man coverage. So like if you're covering on the back end and you're like, okay, we have Alford, Campbell, Trufant, and then we can sort of fudge it with Poole and Neal and Allen, then dialing up I don't know 8 blitzes a game, 10 blitzes a game, 12 blitzes a game, fine with that. In terms of we need to start blitzing like every time on third downs or second and long. I think we need to pump the brakes on that a little bit till we see a little bit more of what some of these guys handle their man coverage assignments. But I'm in favor of more, but I don't know if more means a lot. Then I don't know if I'm in favor of a lot.
Well, let's say Campbell comes back, or not Campbell, Collins and Campbell come back, and things just start looking good as far as their coverage. It might be worth it.
Yeah. I think it's something certainly that needs to be on the table. I think it's certainly something that they can sort of piecemeal out week to week and say, okay, let's dial up 3 more blitzes this week. How do they handle that? Let's do 3 more this, and sort of, maybe 5-6 weeks from now we're a blitz heavy team or something, or it's a regular component of our defense. That's to be seen, but I don't think we need to suddenly start blitzing every down just because Trufant and Alford are good. I don't quite trust everybody else in man coverage quite enough yet to be able to go that far. Big Boy Brewski asks, are you both surprised by our 2 wins so far?
Yes. I'm surprised at how dominant the Falcons looked at times in both of those wins. I'm surprised at how just atrocious the defense looked at times in both those wins. There were times in both those wins where the Falcons were up, I want to say 35 to 17 and 35 to 17 or 35 to 21 in each one of them. And when you're up by 2 touchdowns, everything's lovely, but it's just interesting to see how different the team looks at times.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I said it earlier. I expected both of these last 2 games to be losses for the Falcons, and they won. So by default, I am surprised. I sort of expected a sluggish start this year and a strong finish based off of the quality of the schedule and sort of getting some of these young guys up to speed. So certainly this strong start, I think, is certainly playing into their favor if we're talking playoffs. I'm surprised and pleasantly surprised. Certainly, I think, I knew that the Falcons could be good offensively if they ran the ball. I didn't really expect them to be this good offensively, if I'm being completely honest. I thought, okay, maybe they can get to like 31 points or something if they can run the ball really effectively. But to basically put up 35 last week and 45 this week, and with the potential for putting a 50 burger had they not sort of taken a knee at the end of the game, that has been certainly very surprising to me.
I will say I'm glad that both those games that they won were on the road. It shows they can go out there, play in hostile environments. Trust me, this year, Oakland's black hole was packed, and it was hostile. New Orleans, that's always a hostile environment. Went out in hostile environments and arguably played their best football of the year. I hope they're not peaking too early. I still see a lot of issues with the team. So hopefully this is like their low end of the variance, which if they're doing this and they're winning games and this is the low end, that's great. And the Saints were just banged up and shitty because the Saints are banged up and shitty. But I would love to see them play a lot better than they have. And I know that sounds crazy to be like, hey, they can play better, but they really can play so much better than they've been playing, especially on defense.
Yeah. I got to be a little cautious because of last year and the fast start and then sort of the sputtering finish. So even though I think we're playing much better earlier this year than we have, at least in our 2 wins, than probably other than that Dallas and Houston game, than any of those other 5 wins, particularly on offense, I do have to be a little bit cautious because um, I can't just like, oh, we're 2-1 and this means we're going to go 10-6 or 12-4 or whatever. It's just like, okay, got to take it 1 week at a time, see how they deal with certain challenges this week. Like Carolina's going to be a lot more physical on defense. They're going to be, Cam Newton's going to be a little bit more of a problem. They have probably better receivers than the Saints do overall. Kelvin Benjamin tends to give Desmond Trufant a lot more trouble than Brandon Cooks does. So there are some challenges this week we're going to see how they respond to that. And certainly if they answer those challenges, then I'll be more confident going into the Denver game, the Seattle game, and whatnot. Speaking of which, Yashi Uchiha, I hope I said that name right. If the Falcons play like they have been on offense, can they make it through Carolina, Denver, and Seattle 2-1 or 3-0?
Can they? I think they can. I think their best shot would be to win against Denver and Carolina. Going into Seattle is a really rough environment, and I'm just kind of marking that as a loss right now. If they somehow win that game, I'm going to be ecstatic, but I'm just marking it as a loss. Unless Russell Wilson's out, I don't see any way they win that game. Against Denver, I mean, Simeon's probably the worst quarterback that they'll play this year, just looking at the schedule, at least until the bye. If they can hold out until the bye or they can beat Simeon and beat Carolina, and then, I'm okay with losing in Seattle, be 4-2 after the first 6 games this year against a much tougher group of teams. I'll feel a lot more confident about this team. If they can end up somehow being 6-4 or even 7-3 into the bye, I'll be up there screaming playoffs off the top of the roofs.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think Carolina's probably the best matchup for us just because we're much more familiar with them and they seem to be having a little bit more issues than those other 2 teams right now. I know Seattle has a very weak offensive line, but until I see our pass rush really sort of play well against Carolina or Denver, I'm not going to believe that our pass rush is going to suddenly come alive against the Seahawks offensive line. They'll probably look better than they have at any point this year, but I don't think we're going to suddenly sack Russell Wilson like 8 times or anything like that. These are 3 teams that are known for the defense. Denver's defense is one of the best in the league, if not the best. Seattle is probably, I think they're second in points allowed this year. So if they're not the best now, they probably will wind up being the best by year's end just because you can always trust Seattle's defense to step up and play well. Carolina's defense is obviously no. So to me, like the big question for our offense is, are they feasting on bad defenses and that's why we've seen these last 2 games? Or are they legitimately good and they're going to even give good defenses like Carolina, Denver, and Seattle fits? And right now, I'm not super confident or optimistic that will be the case, but I'm certainly a little bit more optimistic and confident than I was 3 weeks ago before the season started. I gave us no shot to win these games, at the start of the season just because I didn't think our offense would be able to do anything against these defenses. But now I think there's a legitimate shot. 2-1, 3-0 is probably being a little bit overly optimistic. 2-1 is possible. I think 1-2 is good for the team. If they can beat any of these 3 teams, that's good for the Falcons, particularly if it's Carolina because that has playoff implications.
Because that put the Falcons at 2-1 in the division.
Yeah. That would be, probably what I would shoot for. Win this game against Carolina, and then we'll worry about Denver and Seattle later. But certainly if we beat Carolina, I'll be a lot more confident that we can win one of those road games moving forward.
I think if they can beat Carolina, then I think beating Denver will look a lot easier, especially with Simeon at quarterback. And if they get back Collins, they get back Campbell, all of a sudden the defense looks like it's getting everybody back, everybody healthy. If they show some semblance of a pass rush next week, that would look good too. You know, if they can beat Carolina, I think this team looks a lot better long term through the season than it did just 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. Yeah, the concern I have with Denver, you're right about the Denver's offense not being anything to write home about. I think their defense is perfectly constructed to beat our offense, just where they're strong at. You know, they have a big press corner to lead to deal with Julio. They have a great slot corner in Chris Harris. So when you move Sanu into the slot, he's probably going to be taken out of the game. They obviously have Von Miller and DeMarcus Ware to sort of attack on the edges.
Ware's going to be out.
Oh, yeah. You're right. I forgot about that. I was thinking he was going to be back.
And I'm not too worried about Ray coming off the weak side. Because Jake Matthews has been good.
Didn't Ray have 3 sacks against Andrew Whitworth last week?
Whitworth's old. Whitworth doesn't move like he used to. I love Whitworth, but he does not move anywhere close to the way he used to. He's 35, dude.
He's old, but he's still Andrew Whitworth. Like, he's still really good.
He's still Whitworth, but he's not what he was before. He's not anywhere close to what he was before.
Well, the thing I'll say this, and not to be doom and gloom here, but Shane Ray was the pass rusher that gave Jake Matthews, from what I saw, the most fits in college. And Shane Ray was, bull rushing Andrew Whitworth. And if you can bull rush Andrew Whitworth, you can bull rush Jake Matthews, which we know is Jake's weakness. So I'm a little bit more concerned about Shane Ray than you are, but that's understandable, given your history with Shane Ray. So
I don't think he's good.
All right. Well, we'll find out in 2 weeks if he changes your opinion. All right. Craig Phillips, the Sniper for Life, asked, do you think we will stay out west between the Denver and Seattle games?
I think they've already said that they were going to. That's part of the reason why they wanted the back-to-back games on the west. I would say West Coast, but on the western side of the country. Because when you've got 4 games out there, you've got to figure out a way to break it up and make it easier to deal with. The fact that 3 of those 4 games are within a 5-week span right at the beginning of the season, that's not really a great thing, but it does get all that cross-country travel out of the way. And after that stretch, the farthest away game, well, yeah, there's the LA game, but outside of the LA game, after that stretch, there's like the Philly game, the Tampa game, a Carolina game, and then LA. So the travel's going to be minimal. There's also 6 home games after that stretch. So that the schedule travel-wise becomes a lot better.
Yeah, I think Scott's right. I think Dan Quinn already said when the schedule first came out that that was the plan, to sort of stay out west between these 2 games. So, yes, I think the answer is we'll find out if he's changed his opinion, but we'll see what happens.
Plus, it's not hard to believe that, like, his boy Pete Carroll would be like, hey, we know some practice facilities, and actually set him up with a decent practice facility too.
Yeah. We got some Matt Ryan questions coming up. Evan Birchfield asked, what are your thoughts on Matt Ryan's mobility last night?
He runs like a drunk guy. Like when you watch him run, you're just like, oh my God, he's either the worst dad runner of all time, or he is a pure he runs like he's drunk. He runs like there's not a full connect between the top half of his body and the bottom half when he's running the ball, because he hasn't done it ever like that. He is a pocket passer. When he is out there running, he's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And he looks like he's going to shit himself every time.
Yeah, I mean, I think you described it pretty perfectly. I could picture him being wasted at the way sometimes he's running the ball. I think I think he did some good things with his legs. I know he converted a couple of third downs, I think, with his legs. As far as like how he was throwing on the run, on the rollouts and the bootlegs, I think for the most part he did a good job. Like I can only think of maybe 1 or 2 passes that were off the top of my head, but maybe I just sort of I'm so used to him rolling out that I don't really think of them individually and collectively. I think he's done a good job improving his mechanics on those rollouts and whatnot. So yeah, my thoughts are, even though it's a little awkward watching it at times, I think, when Matt Ryan can sort of extend plays and do some stuff, like I'm thinking about it, that one big play at Devontae where he stepped up in the pocket, then ran out to the pocket and then flipped it to Devontae and he got like a 26-yard gain. So, yeah, I'm a fan of Matt Ryan's mobility, even though it looks very, very drunk at times.
He runs like he's drunk. It's not a bad thing. It's just the facts.
It's a fair statement, Scott. I don't disagree with you at all. Andrew Schauweiler, I can't say this dude. Schauweiler asks, don't want to jinx it, but if Ryan continues playing at this kind of level, does he get MVP consideration?
If his production can stay with a similar pace to what he's on, I think so. Especially if the Falcons can win 11, 12 games. Because that's assuming he's going to throw it for 4,800 plus yards, 35 plus touchdowns, have less than 10 interceptions.
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess technically, yeah. I mean, to answer this question, if he continues to play at this pace and the Falcons continue to win games, then sure, yeah, he'll get MVP consideration. This is old man Aaron, but the MVP talk at the beginning of the season, I think, is a waste of energy and breath. Like, you look at Cam Newton last year, he won MVP last year. You look at his first 7 games, he wasn't very good. I think he had like a 75 passer rating or something like that. But for the last 9 games, I think he put up like 115 passer rating and was like threw like 26 touchdowns and like 2 picks or something like that, something ridiculous like that. So I feel like, no one hands out MVPs for how well you play in week 3. This is a conversation that makes more sense in week 13 and sort of, wanting to crown somebody or, saying someone is playing like an MVP the first 3 weeks of the season, I think is kind of a meaningless statement. No one really cares. Like, no one remembers who was the MVP of the first 3 weeks last year. And if you do, then congratulations, you're a genius or something. But these sorts of questions I'm not a huge fan of. No offense, Andrew, but it's just kind of a waste of time for me. Okay, Evan Birchfield asks, who are the top 3 most impressive players from last night?
Devontae Freeman, Tevin Coleman, and oh man, that's tough. I'm gonna go with Deion Jones. I thought he played a great game last night, and I thought that 90-yard interception return, that big play, kind of erases any small mistakes he might have made for me yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, my first 2 are the same, Freeman and Coleman. I'm trying to go with a different one for the third one. No offense to Deion Jones, but just to be different. I want to pick somebody on the offensive line, but I can't think of any without watching the All-22. I can't think of one particular play that really stood out from the rest. But I'll just say this guy, even though he may have wound up being the worst offensive lineman for the team last night. But I'll say Chris Chester just because I think Cameron Jordan didn't take over the game, and he did last year. So credit to Chris Chester for not getting his ass kicked by Cameron Jordan again. So even though that may have nothing to do with Chris Chester, but I'll say that. Basically, whoever was blocking Cameron Jordan. That's my answer. I
mean, Cameron Jordan went from like last year's 7 hits and 3 sacks or something like that to a half a sack and 2 hits last night.
Yeah, I think the 1 sack he got was against Patrick DeMarco too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, well, it was a half sack that he was – it was basically Fairley and Jordan, and they blitzed 7 guys against the 6-man protection.
Yeah.
So you were going to get somebody through.
Yeah. So, okay, we got another long one from Ryan O'Brien. He says, got to give it up to Shanahan again last night for a much better called game, even though the Saints defense is awful. on a scale of 1 to 10, how beautiful was that screen pass to Freeman where Jake Matthews went down the field and blocked the linebacker? That was a great design after the Julio clear out on that side.
I'm only going to give it a 9. I love the play, but I'm only going to give it a 9. Scored a touchdown. I don't know. I thought the little shovel pass that they did on the inside to Justin Hardy, where Hardy almost got denied a touchdown, I thought that was a beautiful design too. I like that one a little bit better, but both plays were great. I loved watching them. And the same little inside zone shotgun play that Tevin Coleman ran his entire career in college, that he scored, 3 touchdowns on this week or 2 touchdowns on this week? Every single touchdown play was something that the player did well and something that took advantage of their strengths. That even that last player where it was Tevin Coleman on that sweep, even though it was an off-tackle sweep, on that standard sweep, that was beautiful to see too.
Yeah, I don't want to take anyone from Shanahan. I guess to answer your question, Ryan, I'll give it an 8 just because I'm more negative than Scott. So I think
it's still a good grade.
Yeah, it's still a good grade, but I just have to keep my reputation. I think this is interesting because I think some of the plays calls that Shanahan made in the red zone, had they not been executed, people would be killing him for it. I think this sort of last night's game speaks to sort of what happens when suddenly you can execute in the red zone. Like the play that immediately pops to mind is that screen pass that they had to Sanu that got, I think, set up one of the Coleman touchdowns. They ran like basically a middle screen, and had Sanu not gotten 16 yards on that play, I think was what he wound up with, and instead got 4, people would be like, oh my God, a red zone screen. Shanahan, you're the worst person alive. But all of a sudden, because you're now executing a lot of these plays, all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's a beautiful design. And it's like, this is the marriage between play calling and execution, where suddenly guys getting their blocks, getting a hat on a hat, guys making plays, making guys miss in the open field, suddenly it looks like a genius play call. Not to say that it wasn't, but, just saying, I'll put my hands down. Just saying, I think at the end of the day, a lot of it is execution more so than great play design. But I won't take anything away from Shanahan's play design because I think, he's been designing decent plays. They just haven't been executed in past games. All right, our next question comes from your boy J94. He asks, if Julio is healthy, he's going for 200, right? Should we worry about our linebackers struggling to get off blocks? This is in reference to the Carolina game, I'm assuming.
I don't know if he's going to do 200, but that would be lovely. I'd love to see him do it. Worrying about linebackers getting off blocks, yeah. They've got to get off blocks. I mean, there's no question there. You have to get off blocks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Panthers secondary's cornerback situation is a little bit better, even though they're rookies, than the Saints was last week. So, but obviously Julio, what did he do last year in that second Panthers game? He put up.
I think he put up a ton of yards.
Yeah, let me look at
it. Like 140 or something like that.
178. So, yeah, I think it's realistically possible that he could do 200 if he goes off. But I do feel like a lot of that is built upon play action passing. I don't necessarily know if Panthers gonna make the mistake of putting Luke Kuechly deep on Julio Jones again this year. So basically I agree with what Scott said about the linebackers. Max Richolds asks, your take on the impact of Gabriel and Robinson on offense.
I think they've been a lot better than what Leonard Hankerson was, and I think they've been a lot better than what Eric Weems would have been, and I think they've been a lot better than having a wasted roster spot on Devin Hester.
Yeah, I think these two guys have contributed a lot more early in the season than I was sort of expecting them to. And it's nice to see the Falcons using more than two wide receivers in their offense, which was really the issue last year. And then when Hankerson got hurt, they were basically using one wide receiver in their offense. So, like, I feel like, getting Gabriel and Robinson and Hardy, 2-3 targets a game and those guys coming through is certainly helping this team be a little bit more well-rounded in their passing game, especially early in the season with Julio being dinged up as much as he is. None of those guys replace Julio, but certainly if you can get like 50% of Julio from those three guys, then that's certainly a positive thing for the Falcons. Rise Up Reader asks, how did Keanu Neal look in his NFL debut?
Solid. I mean, I didn't see any huge busted plays or anything crazy. I thought he did solid. I like him. I think he's going to improve. He's going to give us a big play sooner or later. But as of right now, he's
I think
average.
I think the only one play that really stood out to me that I noticed that was particularly negative was one of those big plays to Fleener where I didn't think Neal got enough depth and basically released Fleener over the middle to Allen, who was playing center field, which Allen wasn't in a position to make that play. I think Gruden called out Allen on that play, but I think it was really more on Neal to sort of get deeper and prevent that. But other than that, I think he was fine. He made a couple of hits. Made a couple of nice tackles. I think the coverage, if you're going to bust him on anything, it's probably coverage. But without watching all 22, I can't be too hard on him before I watch that. So I think it was a solid performance, probably, again, because I don't grade rookies on curves. It's probably like a C-level performance, but that's fine for your first, regular season game for a rookie. So, C plus maybe, I don't know. Delible Think asks, if the Falcons make it to the trade deadline, number one in the division, should they try and trade picks for the pass rush?
Yeah, who's going to trade anybody?
I think Greg Hardy might be available.
Yeah, that ain't happening.
From the Charlotte County Jail. They might trade it to us.
Let me know who's available at the deadline, and I'll let you know what's going on with them.
I would say no in principle to this question. I don't feel like, this to me was an issue last year where people were talking about, trading for a center like Alex Mack at the trade deadline because they wanted to make, they felt like the Falcons were a good center away from making a Super Bowl run. But I think over time that proved to be a false notion. I don't feel like the Falcons need to be giving up future assets to do what? Do we think, maybe, if the Falcons wind up going 3-0 these next 3 games, we might be having a different conversation. But, even still, I don't feel like the Falcons need to be in this mindset of giving up. Next year's draft class is probably going to be really deep in terms of edge rushers. So unless you're giving up a 7th-round pick, and who's going to give you something good for a 7th-round pick, a good pass rusher for a 7th-round pick? Nobody that I can think of. So what's the point? If the pass rush stinks this year, the pass rush stinks this year. And hopefully we, use that number 1 pick or the number 2 pick on a good pass rusher, and hopefully it won't stink next year. That kind of needs to be the plan. Don't start, mortgaging the future just to make a minor upgrade during the middle of this season when you can make a major upgrade in the future. ATL Justin Tyler asked, do you think the Falcons will feature Tevin and Freeman together more or save it for the red zone like we've seen?
I've been wondering this myself, especially since they only really have 2 running backs on their roster. I would love to see a little bit more of them together, but you have to have Coleman improve his pass blocking. whenever Tevin's on the field, either he's running a route or the ball's going to him. And that's all I know how to put it. Like, he's either running that short route or the ball is in his hands. Whenever Freeman's on the field, he's blocking, he's running, he's doing everything you want your running back to do. So if they do start doing a couple more sets, you have to bring in a third running back. You have to bring someone in who, at least, again, I would love to see Brandon Wilds come in and take that third spot, who knows the scheme, brings a little bit of power if you need it in the red zone, and can block. I mean, basically what Teron Ward was, but bigger and can actually run the ball and can actually catch the ball. If you want to run those sets with Tevin and Freeman a little bit more.
Yeah, look, I don't know. to be honest, Justin, like I think it's fine the way they've been using it. I don't feel like it needs to be something that needs to be expanded, particularly. Basically under the idea of it, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, I'm fine with the way they've been used so far, and primarily being used, in those read option-y type of plays in the red zone. I think that works. I don't think it necessarily needs to be a bigger part of our offense, until the rest of our offense starts struggling and we need a shot in the arm, then maybe I'll say, go to it. But right now, the rest of our offense seems to be doing fine without featuring it a whole bunch, between the 20s. So I'm fine with it. Looks like our last question comes from Crandall McCrary, Rise Up 802. Yes. Will this Dan Quinn – grammar. Will this Dan Quinn adjust his defensive philosophy? Our defense is hot ass water.
I mean, I don't think he should. I think when you build a defensive philosophy, you've got to build it around your players. And at this point, Atlanta just needs more talent on defense. I mean, I know that's not the answer everybody wants to hear, but it's just the truth. I mean, they could really upgrade their free safety. As much as everybody loves Ricardo, he's a 5 at best. They could really upgrade their defensive line a lot more, especially the interior guys, the defensive tackles. Not Grady Jarrett, but pretty much everybody but Grady Jarrett on the interior needs to be upgraded. Shelby Shaw. I know Aaron's going to hate my answer here. Jonathan Babineau. All can be upgraded. Although I think this might be Babineau's last season too.
Normally I would jump down your throat, Scott, but it is a contract year, and he does look a little bit more diminished than he has in previous years. So I can't choke you through the screen for saying that. So continue.
Yeah, I'd be perfectly open to the Falcons spending their second-round pick on a defensive tackle and their first-round pick on a defensive end. Hopefully they're not picking in Myles Garrett range and they're picking more in Derek Barnett range. But one of those 6'5", 270-pound defensive tackles would be lovely. And I know you don't love Derek Barnett, but there ain't a lot of help for him on that defensive line.
Yeah, I sit here thinking about like Dan Quinn's defensive philosophy. I don't really have an issue with it. I feel like his philosophy is predicated on sort of having more talented players than the rest of the teams you're playing. And I don't think that's really the issue that, I don't think the Falcons are quite there yet, particularly in their front seven. I feel like, it's going to be a work in progress and it's not going to be immediately fixed. Other than that, I think some of the zone stuff, probably frustrates people just because we seem to give up a lot of easy completions. But I think what Scott said, it is about talent. And, I know it's hot takey at this point in the year, but, I think Derek Shelby so far has been somewhat of a bust. He was asked, we thought we were bringing him in to play that Michael Bennett role. He's been, barely 2% of Michael Bennett. Maybe the Falcons wind up drafting someone like Jonathan Allen early in the draft next year to basically play that same role, or somebody else or something like that. And I feel like all of a sudden you get some horses up front. This defensive philosophy, no one's going to be complaining too much about it. And I think right now the issue is the Falcons have a bunch of ponies. Until that changes, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with Dan Quinn's philosophy. And I don't feel like there's a whole lot of adjustments that he needs to make that he isn't making, other than sort of getting the good defensive line rotation in there on the field at all times. But, I've basically decided that that's just going to be something that is going to frustrate us throughout the year. So I'm not even worried about it anymore. So whatever.
I think getting a big nose tackle or not nose tackle, but a big 3 technique who can both pass rush and run defend in the base would be huge. I think Grady Jarrett getting a big 1 technique who can do the same for the base would be huge. Having Grady Jarrett move to the nickel, having Hageman take over Tyson Jackson's role, and Jackson go bye-bye would be huge. I think that would be great if we could have it all work to the advantage of the team. Having bigger, more athletic players on the field, that's what Dan Quinn's used to. And Atlanta doesn't have that right now. And they really need that. And they really need, and I know Aaron might hate me for saying this, they need someone who can be what Jonathan Babineau was in his prime. And they don't have it.
Yeah, I mean, the way I sort of see it is we have 9 defensive linemen on the roster right now. There's a pretty good chance that 5 of them will not be Falcons next year. That's Babineau, Jackson, Upshaw, Freeney, and I'm blanking on Hageman. And so that basically leaves Claiborne, Shelby, Beasley, and Jarrett.
Yeah.
And, my personal opinion, that's really only 3 guys because I'm not a huge fan of Derek Shelby. But I think, with that being in mind, if you're going to have an 8-man rotation, which is what this team seems to want to do, that basically means you're going to have massive overhaul to your defensive line rotation next year. And maybe a guy like Freeney comes back, maybe Hageman comes back, maybe Babineau comes back on another 1-year deal or something like that. But you're still looking at potentially 3 or 4 major additions to your defensive line next year. That 3 or 4 guys that you want to add 3 or 4 starters. That was something Arthur Blank wanted to add overall in the draft. Next offseason, I want to see the Falcons add 3 or 4 legitimate starting defensive linemen. Whether that comes in the draft and free agency doesn't really matter to me. But that's something that needs to happen, and that's something that didn't happen this offseason. So I think until that changes, I'm not going to put a whole lot of faith in our pass rush, and I'll believe it when I see it. Is basically my approach to the rest of the season. Hopefully they will improve as the season wears on. Hopefully this is just a slow start and they pick things up. And we saw positive things last night against the Saints, and hopefully we continue to see more positive things in the coming weeks. But I don't think the issue is Dan Quinn's defensive philosophy. I think it's talent, and primarily the talent up front.
I 100% agree.
All right. So I think that's it for our show. Folks, we appreciate all the mailbag questions. We appreciate you guys tuning in an hour early than usual on this lovely Tuesday evening. If you want to get your mailbag question in next week, then use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag, or you can tweet at the show at Falcons PFC. My Twitter handle is @FalcFan. Scott is @KarasicS. Scott I'm sure has stuff on deck at Blogging Dirty. Anything that you would like to share with the listeners / viewers, Scott?
No, just pulling up some hot takes and throwing up on Blogging Dirty.
All right. So if you want hot takes, you know where to come. Scott and Aaron, they do it better than anybody else. So you can check out my stuff at falcfans.com. I'll certainly have a column. I'll try to write something between this now and this weekend about this game. Folks, I'm sorry, I'm getting the whole spiel. ProFootballCentral.com. You can find our archives. Check out all the shows on Pro Football Central. You can rate and review us on iTunes. You can find the links to that at Pro Football Central. Subscribe to us on iTunes and Stitcher. And we'll be back next week to talk about the Falcons-Panthers game, and hopefully you'll see me in this Matt Ryan jersey again because the Falcons won the game. So that's our show, guys. Thanks.